Welcome, and thanks for joining us on the Crexi Podcast, an insider's look at all things commercial real estate. Each week, we sit down with CRE experts to uncover trends, insights, and strategies shaping the industry today. I'm your host, Shanti Ryle, Director of Content Marketing here at Crexi, and today we are very excited to sit down with Paul Kurzawa of Centennial. And we got a lot to talk about, Paul, but first of all, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Shanti. I'm good. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, we're very happy to have you here in our LA studio. I know you're a bit of a commuter half the time.
I've been a commuter for a while.
Yeah, all the way out in Dallas. So appreciate you taking the time to come visit here while you're in town. But before we dive into our conversation today, which I'm very excited about, it's a little different than what we usually do when we talk about retail. A little bit about you for our listeners. So, Paul Kurzawa is the newly appointed CEO of Centennial. You just were the president, and now you got the CEO job.
Correct,
so congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, I'm sure talk about that. But at Centennial, where he leads the company's national portfolio of retail and mixed-use destinations. With more than 25 years of experience across lifestyle, open-air, and enclosed retail environments, he specializes in redevelopment, placemaking, I like that word, placemaking, and transforming properties into dynamic, community-centered destinations. Before joining Centennial, Kurzawa held senior leadership roles with CenterCal Properties, the Blackstone Group, Westfield, Caruso, DreamWorks Animation, and Equity Office Properties. I'm sure many of our listeners recognize some of those names. His work has included landmark projects such as the $660 million redevelopment of Willis Tower in Chicago and major mixed-use developments including the Americana at Brand and Westfield Century City, two of my favorite malls in the country. So very excited to talk about that as well. Yep. He is widely recognized for blending operational strategy, experiential retail, and community-focused development to help shape the future of retail destinations, which is a lot of what we're going to cover today.
Thanks, Shanti.
Yeah. So diving in, I know I just read through your bio for our listeners, but I'd love to hear more about your career path in your own words and lessons you've learned along the way. So take us back 25 years ago. Or more.
I don't want to age myself.
Yeah.
Sure.
25 years is what's written down, so we'll stick with that.
Okay, that sounds good.
But how did you first get into commercial real estate?
So my career started, actually I was in Sydney. I was working for MLC, which was a financial services division of Lendlease. Mm-hmm. And they had this program for young upcoming employees where you could work in different parts of the business. And so I put up my hand and was chosen to go work in the retail arm of Lendlease. And so they shipped me out to a shopping centre in Western Sydney called Penrith Plaza. Mm-hmm. And my first job was in marketing. And so and my task just before Christmas was to go with a draft catalogue to all the different retailers to have them sign off on what their offer was. Mm-hmm. And I loved it. I mean, right from the get-go, I enjoyed being out there talking to the retailers. I enjoyed the energy and the atmosphere of walking around the shopping centre. I mean, one of my other tasks was changing out the signage throughout the centres, and I loved it. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of caught the bug. And I think a big part of the bug for me was again just that interaction and the activity and just the liveliness of it. And I remember sitting down with the general manager. I think it was my second or third week, and we sat there for an hour, and he told me all the basics of the business of how rent works and expenses and occupancy costs and all this stuff that's very rote, but I just soaked it up. And so that's really how it started. I just caught the bug there. Yeah.
So retail, was it, you started there, you're like, this is where I'm going to end up?
I think that's actually consistent for most people in the business. Yeah. Like, there's... and even moving to the United States is the same thing. I mean, we're a very, very unique breed.
Yeah. So what brought you ultimately to the U.S. then after you got the retail bug, started working directly with these brands, seeing how people operated and visited shopping centers? What brought you here?
So as a part of the program that I was in, they had a program called the Career Advancement Plan. And so and there were 9 of us that were a part of this program. And And they had an opportunity to send one person to the United States to work with the Yarmouth Group, which was the division of Lendlease that they had acquired here in the United States, starting in San Francisco. And so I put up my hand and said, sure, I'll give it a go. And I wasn't expecting to be chosen. So they called me in. Actually, it was my birthday in 1996, and they called me to the head office. And I'm like, they're just going to tell me that, I didn't get it. And they said, so we went through and we went through all the candidates, and we've chosen who we want, and we've chosen you.
Best birthday present ever.
I was blown away. It was better for me. So then I went back to the office and I called my mum, and she's like, "Oh my God, how long are you going to the States for?" And I said, "It's just a year." The interesting thing about that is every time I go home, she always reminds me, well, you said you were only going to be there for a year.
Yeah, clock's ticking. When are you moving back?
Yeah. A wife and kids and a family kind of.
It's a good reason to stay, certainly.
So anyway, so that's how it happened. So, and at the time, Lendlease was on an expansion mode globally. And so, as I mentioned, they had purchased the Yarmouth Group, which was a boutique real estate firm, of which they had a retail arm. And the day that I actually moved to the United States, Lendlease closed on the acquisition of Equitable Real Estate.
Oh, okay.
So it was a big time, for the company, and the timing was actually perfect because it gave me an opportunity to further my career in retail real estate. And several months after I came here, I had an opportunity to work on the redevelopment of Fashion Valley in San Diego.
I love Fashion Valley too. How fun. Sorry, I'm very excited about retail. I know.
And that was an amazing experience, but also, being a young Aussie bloke, moving to San Diego was actually pretty cool too.
Yeah. I mean, that was like around the time that like Crocodile Dundee was a huge deal. So I say this only because my mother-in-law is Australian, and when she came to the United States, she's like, ooh, everyone loves me here. So I'm sure that charm definitely played into some of the early.
It didn't hurt.
Yeah. So, okay, you get to the States for your first year, and it coincides with all these big acquisitions and opportunities opening up. So I'm curious, what were some things, either back in Oz or coming to the United States, those early lessons that you think put you on your superior's radar as somebody who's a good fit for these opportunities? What do you think they saw in you? What did you see in yourself back then, and how did you build up the skill set needed to make yourself the right fit when those opportunities arose?
That's a really good question. I just think, again, kind of going back to, I've always kind of taken the view with my career of just being very hungry and curious. And so a big part of it was just kind of looking for that next opportunity, but also, and being in the United States, the retail here and the retail business was so much more mature than where the Australian retail business was. And the psychology of an Australian consumer is very, very different to an American consumer, and that's a whole discussion that we could have. Yeah. But for me, that led to a lot more opportunities to try different things. Yeah. And just have a different approach. And I think in some respects, I was very fortunate that coming to a new country, you have a slightly different lens that you can bring to a conversation, bring to a project that you're working on. And again, I started my career in marketing, and so it allowed me to tap into a little bit more creativity. Yeah. And that maybe gave me a little bit of an edge where perhaps I brought a slightly different perspective than folks that grew up here had. And that was just something that just came out of growing up in a different country and just having a completely different perspective and, frankly, a different accent that perhaps nobody actually understood what the hell I was talking about.
They're like, we like him, though. Let's
we don't know what you're talking about, but that's fine. We'll give you this role and off you go.
Hey, not gonna sniff at that.
But also it came with a hell of a lot of hard work. And look, yours here, America, has given people a lot of opportunity, and I think that was, certainly the case with me. I think back, and I share with my kids now, when I started in this country, I arrived with a suitcase, a big box of belongings, and $2,000. That's it.
Yeah.
And so, the industry, but also the country gave me an opportunity to kind of grow my career, and here we are today having the conversation, and I feel very humbled that, you want to ask me about real estate. So I think, hopefully I've made a little bit of a mark in terms of some of the the projects I've worked on, but more importantly, the people along the way that I've hopefully helped to kind of grow in their own careers.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll definitely talk a bit about that leadership perspective as well and helping pay it forward, what you learned from the early days. I do want to talk about some of your iconic work history. Like I said, I love the Americana brand. Caruso. Is it Caruso Properties? Is that the actual business name or just Caruso?
Caruso. It used to be Caruso affiliated, and I think they're just Caruso now.
Yeah. Just the design, the mimicking of like Disneyland's-esque vibe, that really consumer, almost obsessed concepting that went into how that place was built, and the Grove, for that matter. That's right next to me, and I love the Grove. But, Americana, Century City is such an open, inviting, there's always people there at that shopping center. I would love to hear more about your experience working on those projects in particular, and then a step beyond that, working at firms like Westfield, like Caruso, like Blackstone, and even like DreamWorks, which is a little bit of a pivot. So I'm just going to lay that all out in front of you, and you pick what you want to start with.
Well, maybe I'll start with Westfield.
Okay.
I joined Westfield just before 2000. And, at the time, they were very much in growth mode. I think they had just purchased the Han portfolio of 35 assets. And I think at the time it was maybe close to a portfolio of 65 or so assets, 68 assets.
Okay.
And the company was very much entrepreneurial in feel. And the attitude was just get it done. And there was a phrase that they used in the organization, which was cash is king. And so it was driving the business. But you have to understand, like growing up in Australia, Westfield, we're everywhere, right? And in Australia, growing up, people, and even today, they don't say they're going to the mall or they're going shopping. They say they're going to Westfield. And so the brand for the Lowy family who started Westfield was very, very important. And their business approach was to create these shopping destinations, put the brand on it, and then create an experience around the brand. And so, they came to the United States and built this portfolio of shopping centers. And I remember when I joined the company, they were out rebranding a lot of the shopping centers they were acquiring as Westfield shopping towns, which is what they were called in Australia. And I remember, folks saying, what is this Westfield shopping town? And nobody really kind of understood why you would brand a shopping center. But again, the core of the business was the promise of creating an experience that was the right curated retail mix. It was safe. It was clean. There were marketing events. We had a Westie, the kangaroo, which would show up at all of the.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah, it was a thing.
That's amazing.
Actually, when I managed Valley Fair up in San Jose, I was Westie one day. The guy who was meant to show up didn't show up, and so I was Westie the kangaroo.
No kidding.
Yeah, no,
That's
it's
amazing.
true. And because I'm a little bit bigger than the costume, my arms were kind of sticking out a little bit. And then I wiped out a bunch of kids with the tail when I was turning around. But anyway, beside the point.
Occupational hazard.
Yeah. But it was a lot of fun. And again, a lot of it was about that experience and the promise surrounding the brand. And so that was the success of the organization. But getting back to the cash is king, there was a very deliberate focus on making sure you had the right retailers, they were paying the maximum amount of rent. I mean, it was really about not only creating this great experience, but also driving the business and the return to the shareholders, right? Was the name of the game.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, it was exciting. It was a lot of hard work. And I was with Westfield, I think probably about 8 or 9 years.
Okay.
And then I was actually working with them up in San Jose on Valley Fair, so I worked through the first and the second phases of the redevelopment of Valley Fair. And then the company moved me down to work on the first phase of Century City, the redevelopment of Westfield Century City. So my wife and I moved the family down to LA, and we started going through that project. And actually, before this podcast, I was just meeting with someone at Century City, and we were talking about what the center used to look like back, in 2004 when I started there.
Yeah.
And to see where it's come to what it is today.
Yeah.
I mean, not only is it an incredible piece of real estate, But the experience that Westfield have invested in creating is exactly what that asset deserves for being in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
But anyway, so my point was I moved to LA, worked through the first phase of Century City, and what an interesting part of what we created there was the dining terrace upstairs, the food court. But it wasn't a food court. There's a reason that it was called a dining terrace, because we wanted to create more of a restaurant-style experience.
Sure.
And when we opened it up, we had our staff bussing tables. We would provide we provided the retailers with proper cutlery, knives and forks, and we had a whole scullery back there, and we operated like an extended restaurant.
Oh, wow.
Just so we could elevate the experience.
Yeah.
Same retailers, same food operators as you'd see at a traditional mall.
Yeah, yeah.
But just the whole experience was a lot different. And so we invested a ton of time and money in executing that. And there was nothing else like it in the United States.
Yeah.
And it was based on something Westfield had done in Sydney with one of their centres at Westfield Bondi. But anyway, that I was proud of that because it was kind of cutting edge here.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, I had the good fortune of meeting Rick Caruso, and Rick convinced me to come and join him, and the company. And it wasn't so much the conversation that he and I had in his office, but it's what happened afterwards. And at the Grove, at Caruso's head office, they have a room. I don't know if they've still got it. And they called it the War Room, where they'd have all of the different designs and plans and projects they were working on.
Yeah.
And in the middle of the room, he had a scale model of the Americana at Brand. It was the shops at Santa Anita.
Okay, yeah.
And I stood there for 10 minutes watching Rick explain the whole experience and the vision he had for the shops at Santa Anita. And so it wasn't about the conversation about what my compensation was going to be. That's not what convinced me to join Rick. It was about watching him and the vision that he had for this experience that he was going to create, that I wanted to, that's what had really attracted me to go join him and Caruso. And so I made the decision and I changed.
Yeah.
I had a little over 8-year career working with Rick, and it was an amazing transition to go from a company that was very driven by brand and experience, and did a fantastic job of doing that. But driving ultimately the bottom dollar and driving value, to working with a visionary that really kind of looked at creating value through the eyes of a consumer and creating a true experience that ended up resulting in value creation.
Yeah.
And he does that very well by really creating aspirational experiences. When you go to the Grove, you feel like you're in a very special place.
Yes.
When you look around you, it's the same retail that you could find anywhere else, really, with the exception of a few unique retailers. And the Grove and the Americana have come a long way in terms of their merchandising and kind of what the team's done there.
Yeah.
But the point is that I think what I learned in the difference between what Westfield did with branding and the value proposition there, and what Rick did in terms of building experiences, is the true value of what a person, a human being, and the connection they make to the place they're in.
Yeah.
Everyone talks about placemaking.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a bit stereotyped now. People just throw it around and without really kind of thinking about what it really means. And it means, and I've learned this over the years, it's about what truly people connect with when they enter a retail destination. Whether it's Century City, whether it's the Americana, whether it's the Summit Birmingham, which is one of our centres in Birmingham. It's about the connection that a person makes with that place, and frankly, is probably a little bit of the magic that helped retail survive the pandemic.
Yes, I 100% agree with that, and we'll be getting into that a bit later in our conversation. But I do want to underline, too, kind of the third piece of this puzzle, I think, of your origin story, if you will. You have the obsessive branding and, like, this is the vision. We're leaning in. We're not just a shopping center. We are Westfield. And the deep dive into the nuance of what are the very, like, tiny details I can add to this place to make it something that maybe isn't consciously recognized by the visitor, but is cumulatively something that's really transformative and magical. I want to tie that back to DreamWorks a little bit, because you started in marketing, and marketing at its core is a form of storytelling. So I'm curious, how does that component play into the trifecta?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking the question. It was a little bit of a right-hand turn.
Okay.
What's interesting, when I was working with Rick, Disney actually approached us and asked us if we would help them with some of their reimagining of their retail destinations. And so we did a little bit of that work.
With Downtown Disney?
Disney and Disney Springs as well. And that was great. And, it was an opportunity to kind of help and lean into our expertise to help them. And frankly, it was flattering, that Disney would come and, and ask us to do that. And so DreamWorks had a similar opportunity in China that they were working on. It was actually a brand new development that they were doing just outside of Shanghai with China Media Capital. And Jeffrey approached us and asked if we would help. And so I spent some time working with Jeffrey and his team on some of that work. And then Jeffrey, several months later, presented me with an opportunity and said, look, why don't you come to the studio and utilize the storytelling, as you said, and some of the technical wizardry of the studio to kind of help shopping center developers around the world reinvent their real estate. And it was a bit of a leap of faith, leaving retail and leaving real estate. And I remember my first day at the studio after making the decision to join the studio. I found myself in a mocap with
all the sensors and everything.
with two actors that were actually working on a Puss in Boots show. And they've got all these little things, and they're kind of doing they're going through their action moves. And I'm standing behind the monitors watching how that's kind of translating into the models. And I'm like, what am I doing here?
I got to get back to Australia. My mom's waiting.
And over a very short period of time, we started to build several concepts to kind of help reinvent shopping destinations and create a new reason for people to go there with entertainment activities. And there were a bunch of different ones that we had started working on. One was a large family entertainment center, which I'll come back and talk about in a minute. And then just out of the blue one night, I kind of thought to myself, the kind of the low-hanging fruit here is how shopping centers celebrate the holidays. And I'm like, it's kind of, you go take your kids to the mall, you go sit down with Santa, and the kids share what they want for Christmas, and then they kind of leave. And I'm like, surely in today's day and age, we could do a much better job of that. And so it wasn't the task that I joined the studio to do, but I found myself assembling a team of ex-colleagues and people that I knew in the business to create really a spin on the trip to go see Santa. And what we did is we took the Santa's cottage, and rather than just kind of what it is today, which is generally just a very materialistic house, we replaced all the outside with digital screens, and with that we could animate it.
Cool.
And then inside we created a 7-room experience where essentially you would go from the shopping center and take a journey on a sleigh to the North Pole. And when you'd arrive there, using technology, Santa would know the kids' names. He'd know what they want for Christmas. And so, we did all of this, and it was just, it was tremendous. And so in the first maybe 16 months with the studio, we'd built a small team of, I think, probably 80 people, and we built 9 of these dream places, they were called. And we had them around the country, and it was just tremendous. And so what that did was it started to, I think, raise the bar a little bit in terms of what holiday experiences can be and what activations in shopping centers can be. And it was an exciting time to start kind of playing in that field. And then there were some other studios and some other entertainment developers that started to pop up and create their own, which was great. And then, but it didn't really resolve the issue of, department stores going, closing, becoming dark. At the time, Barnes & Noble were closing a bunch of stores.
When was this? Like late
This
2010s?
was 2014.
Okay. Yeah.
So they were on the cusp of starting to see a lot of these big boxes starting to come back to landlords.
Yeah.
And how do you resolve that? And so the studio put together a plan which was a 50,000 square foot facility that we called Dream Play. Mm-hmm. And what it was a very kinetic, interactive experience that you could bring your families to. And it was all of the different tentpole properties that DreamWorks had. Yeah. It was Kung Fu Panda and Shrek, and we had climbing facilities. We had, like with Kung Fu Panda, we created an experience where you can go and learn Kung Fu.
Amazing.
It was a blast.
Yeah.
And so the first facility that the studio built was in the Philippines. It was in Manila. And Jeffrey always joked and said, well, if it doesn't work, the good thing is it's in Manila. Well, the problem is it worked, and it was hugely successful. It's still there today at the City of Dreams.
Amazing.
And what it kind of opened up is a new opportunity to kind of do these family entertainment centers on a grander scale.
Sure.
And since then, we've seen more and more of these sort of experiences pop up. Mm-hmm. There's Crayola experiences that have popped up. There's Nerf experiences.
All the VR headset
all the VR,
walkthroughs,
exactly.
Yeah.
There's more and more of them. Then Top Golf have kind of got their own concept.
Yeah. Yep.
There's one with, I'm blanking on the name, but it's a batting one now with baseball.
Yes, I know what you're talking about. I can't remember the name either.
It's on the tip of my tongue.
Pickleball.
Paddleball. So all of a sudden, you're starting to see more of these entertainment experiences coming out. The biggest challenge that I had at DreamWorks was finding a way to build these entertainment concepts in a cost-effective way. A lot of them can be very capital intensive.
Sure.
They're great experiences, they're very capital intensive. That was then.
Yeah.
Now 10 plus years on, I think entertainment developers are starting to become a little bit more smarter in terms of how they can create these experiences and be a little bit more effective in terms of how much they cost to build. I think landlords are also leaning in and willing to put in a little bit of their own money to create these attractors and to bring these experiences to their centers as a point of differentiation. I think that's going to continue, and we're going to see more of that. I was delighted to see Netflix come out with their Netflix house. Great.
Oh gosh, yeah, it's always packed. The one on Fairfax, right?
Have you been to it?
I haven't, but I see lines down the block all the time.
The one in Dallas. So there's one in Dallas just down from our office, and same thing. And look, all of the feedback is really positive. I think these are the sorts of opportunities to repurpose space and create entertainment experiences that is just more than F&B. That's kind of exciting, and it's kind of the new evolution, if you will, of our business.
Yeah, people are, and just going to the psychology of it all, like you said, post-COVID really put a wind on those sails because people are desperate for community, desperate for things to do together with humans, especially in an age of, talking to your AI about your problems.
Yep. That
human connection is so important. And I think these are taking the place of what maybe otherwise would be filled by, rec centers, old school ways of bringing communities together. Like these offer something new, something exciting, and something that ultimately is a boon for those in the periphery of that space where the event's happening.
Yeah.
And you're kind of ahead of the curve on that stuff too, because now almost every e-commerce brand, when they want to plant a little flagship activation somewhere, they go to malls to do it. Every week I see something in that little pop-up space at the Grove, something different. It's some brand trying, can I exist in the real world now? But it's also a destination for visitors.
Yeah.
They know that brand's coming and they want to get there and check it out.
Yeah. Look, I think in some respects the business, pre-pandemic kind of was in a bit of a slump. In some respects, I think, and I'm just talking broadly about the industry from my perspective, kind of lost that sense of discovery to your point. And what e-commerce did is, if you look at a platform like Amazon, when Amazon first came out, you do your search and find the product you want, and then they got a little bit smarter with their algorithms, and they were then able to kind of tell you, okay, well, people who bought this also bought this.
Yeah.
the refresh rate of the app when you go searching on Amazon went from a few seconds to milliseconds. And then the masterful part of that technology is discovery happens really quick. So when you think of physical retail, we had to work harder to figure out how do you change a storefront that quickly? Like if you're browsing, it's easier to do it online and then go, buy the product versus wandering around a shopping center and seeing, a pair of shoes that you saw last week when you were visiting. So in some respects, it kind of helped retail say, okay, here's a time for us to evolve, and maybe change up, the experience and how fast we're able to deliver that experience and the product to customers. Just before the pandemic, I had somebody one day come up to me and said, "So what do you do?" I said, "I'm in retail," and they said, "Well, I'm sorry."
Like, thanks.
Yeah,
I guess.
And I'm like, "Why?" And they were like, "Well, retail's dead." Online's gonna kill retail. What are you gonna do for a career? And I thought that was highly offensive. But and it did make me think.
Yeah.
But then, going into the pandemic, I think a lot of people, thought, well, okay, this could be the kiss of death for retail. I mean, we're all going to become so accustomed to sitting around the house and ordering everything online that, that's going to be the new norm.
Yeah.
And it wasn't. Because what everyone really, really missed and desired to do, as you said a short time ago, is they wanted to be together. They wanted to get out and they wanted to walk the mall. They wanted to go try stuff on, wanted to go hang out with friends, grab a cup of coffee, a bite to eat. And so, if anything, the pandemic actually kind of re-energized retail.
Yeah.
And really, highlighted the fact that we are social creatures. We need to get out. We want to be together. We want to taste, smell things. We want to go to Netflix house and have that and, live that experience that we've watched, online. Whatever it is, I just think it kind of got us all thinking again about how important that part of the connectivity is of being people going out and being together. And so, but as well, it's an exciting time because I think we've hit that new evolution of, what's the next generation of retail shopping centers in America.
Oh, yes. And it's so interesting, too. We'll get into this as well. I do want to ask about your new job. But I think it's so interesting to kind of see how it has trickled down to the everyday mom and pop retailer as well. COVID, on one hand, kind of scared everybody with the shutdown, but it made a lot more operators way more technologically savvy. And I think with that, it's essential as a store that you have an Instagram or you don't exist. That discoverability does happen online first, but then the payoff is in that satisfying and exciting retail experience in person. And I think it's just so fascinating how that's gone from, these big brands like Westfield to it's trickled throughout retail. And I think even like the smaller strip malls are now thinking very much about like, okay, like maybe I have some kind of experiential component in my very limited square footage, but it's really filtered all the way through the different subclasses of retail. So with all of that I appreciate the big picture of everything you've done thus far. Now you're at Centennial. You've been there how long now?
20 months.
20 months. Oh, and already now you're stepping in as CEO. So please, just for our listeners, give us a little story about, how did you end up there after all of these experiences and all these amazing projects you worked on? What is Centennial and what does this new piece of news mean for the forward-looking goals of your team? So
I had the great fortune of meeting Centennial's founder, Stephen Levin, about 10 years ago. I was asked by the then president, Whitney Livingston, to come on board to actually take a look at their operations and how maybe there are some efficiencies and opportunities to maybe improve the experience. But the other part was to actually work with some of the branded studios to create some holiday experiences, which we did.
They loved the Santa thing.
Yeah, well, we did. One was Elf on the Shelf, another was Polar Express, and it was again creating branded experiences as a point of differentiation. But so I had the opportunity of working with Stephen and and the rest of the Centennial team, and really loved the culture of the organization. And you know, and if you look at kind of what the company has done, so a little over 10 years ago, the company purchased 5 Westfield shopping centres, and together with their partner USAA, went about kind of reinventing them.
Sure.
Reinventing not only some of the common areas inside, but also densifying the sites, bringing in residential, and kind of utilising some of the space very differently. And it was bold.
Sure.
You know, not many shopping centre developers were taking regional enclosed malls and doing that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But Stephen, together with the partner USAA, did have a vision. They executed on that, and it was great. I mean, it was really well received, and you know, and it was successful. And I really admired that. So in October of 24, shortly after Centennial was acquired by Lincoln Property Company, of which we are now a part. The then president had made a decision to move over to ICSC, and Stephen called me and said, "Would you like to come on board?"
Yeah.
And so we sat down and met, and he talked about kind of the future and what Centennial had in front of it, but more so the opportunities that came a part of being now a part of Lincoln and being the retail operating platform for Lincoln.
Sure. And
how complementary that was to what Lincoln have in all the other asset classes of multifamily, of office, medical, etc. And in addition to, you know, the relationships that they have with capital partners. And that was very exciting to me.
Yeah, it's nice to have a big checkbook.
Or at least knowing people who do have a big checkbook. So anyway, so I made the decision to join the company. And it kind of felt, as I said to the senior team when I started my first week, it kind of felt like I was coming home. And it's because of, the culture that Stephen had created in the organization, which is one that's kind of really rooted in just people. And when Stephen talked to the company and addressed them, he would always come back to talking about people. And so for me, that was a big part, you know, of kind of the, you know, if you want, the emotional connection that I had with the organization. So it did kind of feel like I was coming home. And I couldn't be more proud of being a part of this company, of folks that are made up of, you know, the same passion and energy and drive, and just kind of helping support them at what they do so great. Has just been wonderful. So that's how I ended up coming back to Centennial. Yeah.
And now here you are, steering the ship.
Steering the ship.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of was. I was mostly steering the ship.
Sure.
When I jumped on board.
Yeah.
And so, you know, in a lot of respects, I think, you know, at some point this was anticipated that there was going to be a change. And you know, Stephen's just such a wonderful guy, and you know, I mean, I've learned so much from the time that we've known each other and we've worked together, and he's so highly respected. There, hands down, is nobody else in the industry that is nicer than Stephen Levin. And so, you know, with that, you know, he, you know, even though he's retired from the company, I don't think Stephen will ever retire from the industry.
Yeah, he has too much fun.
You know, he caught the bug a lot earlier than I did.
Sure.
But he, you know, I mean, he will move to his next chapter in terms of what he wants to do, and I know that, you know, that what he will do will be very, very exciting.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we'll hear all about it in due course.
Yeah.
But look, in some respects, for me personally, it doesn't change a lot relative to the day-to-day company, which I was already immersed in. But what it does do is give me a renewed energy and somewhat a sense of urgency in terms of what we need to do from a growth perspective.
Yeah.
It's the right time in our business right now, with the convergence of, you know, both the capital markets being a little bit more receptive and a little bit more open to retail, you know, and some more emerging, you know, retail opportunities to invest in.
Yeah. Also, you know, going way macro, I feel like in times of like a little economic uncertainty is where a lot more people start becoming very entrepreneurial, and they're like, all right, I'm going to take whatever opportunity I can make by the horns. So I'm sure there's a lot of like, let's move on some plans now. So I think that's actually a really great segue. The time is now. The time is right. You have this renewed sense of urgency. What are you watching from the head of the ship? You're looking at the retail landscape. We've talked a lot about the trends that you yourself helped usher in as a pioneer in a lot of the experiential side. But what are you seeing operators doing now? What are you seeing landlords doing now in this environment with all this different swirling macro influences of rates are no longer zero, of construction costs are still pretty darn elevated post-COVID, of fuel is more expensive, of the dollar, it's not as as strong as it was.
Yep.
And there's a little bit of consumer uncertainty. So there's a lot kind of swimming underneath the surface there. And yet so many people in the retail space are on fire and so excited about the opportunities. So I'd love to get your 30,000-foot overview.
That's a big, juicy question.
It's what I do.
Wow. Okay. Well, look, I mean, I'll start with the consumers because that's really the most important. There is a lot of uncertainty. A year ago, everyone was talking about tariffs and, going into ICSC Vegas. The question du jour was, well, how do you see tariffs impacting the retailers? Well, what we've since learned is it actually didn't have too much of an impact. What I do know is that in a lot of respects, the retailers, and I'm sure this is consistent through other industries as well, were actually trying to insulate consumers from the impact of tariffs by sacrificing some of their margin.
Wow.
And so maybe that is why there wasn't so much of an impact. Maybe consumer sentiment was actually stronger than what we all gave it credit for. It could also just be that retail is still enjoying its renaissance. This year, here we are almost 12 months later, and, we're faced with, higher gasoline prices, still the same economic uncertainty. The stock market's a bit of a roller coaster.
A little bit. Just a little bit.
Just a tad. But yet the kind of, and again, ICSC Vegas was just last week, and the sentiment was very, very optimistic, cautiously optimistic, but it was optimistic. And the energy at the conference was unbelievable.
Yes.
So that really speaks to, I think, not only from an industry standpoint that there's still a lot of opportunity out there, and I think there's certainly some optimism. But again, it's all kind of rooted back to the consumer, and if the consumer is still out there spending, which we haven't seen any major markers right now as we sit here today that show that there is a drop off in terms of their spending, that will continue to fuel the business going forward.
Yeah.
And that is a trickle-on effect, right? And then obviously in terms of where, what we can do in terms of reinvesting capital into our existing centers, attracting new brands, and new uses to each of our retail destinations, which is obviously always very important from just staying relevant in each of their respective markets. But also just from looking at new opportunities where maybe, some of the stuff that we've looked at over the last 12 months, in some respects, these are centers that haven't had that reinvestment opportunity under their current ownership. And that provides an immense, value proposition for us to come in at the right price to reinvest capital and actually, create the next story of what that retail destination wants to be. And we just recently announced the sale of Annapolis Mall to Macerich. And that's a good example of that. And that was very quick. That was from acquisition to disposition of Annapolis, that was about 20 months.
Oh my gosh,
very quick.
Is very quick.
Very quick, but that's a perfect example of what I just said. You find the right asset that is a market dominant asset in Maryland, as it was. I mean, it is the number one enclosed mall within a 25-mile radius. It is great real estate. It just needed a new story. And so together with Kildare, our capital partner, and with Atlas Hill, who was our partner on the leasing side, within 20 months, we kind of changed the whole trajectory of the property, the way it was operated. Atlas Hill leased over 500,000 square feet of space to some brand new retailers that came in, and we had an opportunity to exit that. to Maestridge, who'll then continue on that story for the project.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good example of not only what we were able to assemble and, what Centennial and Atlas Hill and Kildare were able to pull together, but I think it's also testament to kind of what we'll probably start seeing a lot more of on the retail side.
Yeah.
So I've probably only answered a fifth of the question that you asked.
Yeah. Well,
But
I mean, it's a good starting point because I think, to the consumer side of things, Gen Z loves malls, loves enclosed malls. And I think, going back to the psychology of people want to be together, you can kind of track, okay, as this new generation of consumers comes in, where are they going to start setting up the habits that they're going to bring into adulthood, especially as they start having more of a disposable income. And it's really interesting to see, are there many operators that can do what you do at that level, come in and basically flip a regional mall in 20 months at a profit?
I'm sure there are.
Yeah.
I hope there aren't that many, so we can do more of them.
Sure.
Look, I mean, I think there are. Every deal is very different.
Sure.
Annapolis was a unique opportunity, but I do think that there's going to be more of those types of opportunities going forward. For me, having spent almost 30 years in the business, a lot of it is having creating that vision, understanding who your customer is, but more importantly, understanding who's the customer that you want to attract to that center.
Mm-hmm. Meaning the consumer or eventually the person who will buy the property?
So, there's two ways of viewing, if you look at a retail destination, if you look at, if you look at like a Century City, the way it used to be, it was appealing to, obviously a broader trade area on the west side. Mm-hmm. But by renovating the center, expanding it, bringing in new retail brands, first to market concepts, great restaurants and dining, all of a sudden you're able to draw a much bigger trade area. So now, to the point I just made, is now you're able to bring in a new customer that wasn't coming there before. And that's the trick, is to kind of figure out. That's why, going back to my DreamWorks days, creating these entertainment experiences that are really like nothing else. Because what you want to do is you want to be the shopping destination that has that experience, or has that retailer, or has that restaurant that your competitors don't, so that the customer drives past the competitor and comes to you.
Yeah. And I understand probably not only that, but ideally one that appeals to a couple different demographics. So you got the families bringing their kids, and then the kids bring their
absolutely. Yeah. No, absolutely. And that's the trick. And then the hard part is executing on that.
Sure.
And actually you got to have the capital. You got to have the story, and you got to be able to to convince that brand that whether it's a retailer, that restaurant, that entertainment concept, whatever it happens to be a part of that story going forward. That's where it becomes a little bit more challenging. But again, if you've got the right conviction and you've got the right team to be able to support it, you can make it happen.
Yeah.
Our business is really, really fun. It's also really, really hard too.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. So I'm curious, in the domain of connecting with these operators and tenants and brands that are, obviously there's a draw to being at a mall because it's an epicenter in communities, but there's a lot that goes into site selection. There's a lot that goes into their operational expenses. It's going to be one of the biggest line items on their budget to start renting.
Yep.
So I'm curious, are you seeing different patterns in how operators are approaching these conversations with you? Like, why should I be in this space? Are you going to give me any TIs, co-tenancy conversations? What are you seeing from maybe different uses and different types of brands?
Yeah, look, I think in a lot of respects, the operators, the retailers, the brands, they're very well educated now than what they were 15 years ago.
Yes.
They have a lot more information at their fingertips. They know who their customer is. They know where the customer is moving to. They also know the customer that they want to capture. Not always, though. Sometimes, if we have a different view of say, for example, if we want to attract a grocery store, is doing our own research and building a case to then present to whatever that chain happens to be, of why they're missing a customer segment.
Sure.
So it's a little bit of both.
Yeah. You go after and you bring the flowers sometimes.
Yeah. And the checkbook.
Yes,
that always helps. But look, every deal is a little bit different, right?
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes you want that brand that is not really a great deal from an economic standpoint, but it's the right deal to do because it's accretive to the merchandising mix that you're trying to curate, and B, it allows you then to attract more of the retailers that you want to lean into to attract to be in that shopping destination.
Yeah.
So sometimes you're making the hard decision to make those deals that are really difficult to do, but you do it because in the long run you're going to make it up in bushels by doing other deals that that you wouldn't be able to attract if you didn't do that one deal.
Yeah, you got to have an attractive portfolio because that'll hopefully more honey will help.
And that's why with like entertainment experiences, I mean department stores in our business, and whether it's in Australia or here or wherever, we're kind of seen as the attractor. I mean, you'd get your JCPenney's and your Macy's and your Bloomies, and your Nordstroms, and they would be the attractors, right? And they still are today, in some respect, depending on the market and the shopping centre. But I think that's evolved too. Then you've got Apple.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
You've got all the athleisure. You've got I mean, it's great to see this year the Barnes & Noble are opening new stores. I mean, a
great renaissance for
right?
that company. Absolutely.
I mean, who would have thought?
Yeah.
5 years ago, you'd be like, can you imagine in the future Barnes & Noble are going to start opening bookstores again? You'd be like, what?
Yeah. Well, they're a great case study, honestly, because I think, and this is all a red thread of what you've been talking about, they are really leaning into the placemaking. They give a lot of the employees authority to really curate the store. These are, the employee recommendations. They write little blurbs. There's a lot of local events they curate there. Yep. And I think, leaning on the team that's on the ground to create that sense of community within the store, within wherever shopping center they are, again, it's really created them into an anchor tenant in a lot of powerful ways. And I mean, Book Talk helped a lot, honestly.
Yeah.
Young people are reading.
Yeah.
But it's a good example of we just want to create something that's very high quality and touches the human experience and connection.
Right.
And that will ultimately have a great return on investment. But we care about making the thing really good first.
Yeah. And that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Back to basics. Again, we've got, most people have a personal device, an iPad, or they can read books wherever they want, right? Yeah. But there's nothing quite like, going into a bookstore and grabbing having a browse, finding a book, sitting down, grabbing a coffee and just sitting there for a while and just reading.
Yeah. My husband and I do dates at Barnes & Noble.
Yeah.
Yep.
and so going back to kind of why that's relevant is, that is an attractor. That's an example of an attractor where it's like, I want to go do that. I want to just do something for myself. I want to go meet my friends there as well. And look, you talked about, the investing in placemaking. I mean, Macy's and Bloomingdale's came out a few months ago and said they were going to start reinvesting in the experience in their stores.
Awesome.
Right?
Love to hear that.
I think Target has done the same thing as well as Walmart.
Yeah.
These are good signals that these big retailers are reinvesting in their store experience because they recognize the value of making that connection with the customer, and it's so important. It's more important, in my opinion, than necessarily the product that they've got. For the same reason that if you create a really great shopping destination that's just a fantastic experience, you just feel good, so you want to go there, even though it's the same retail that you could go down the street and get probably, or that you can buy online.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's not about the thing anymore, because to your point, you can just get it Amazon to you overnight if you just want the thing.
You want to feel good.
Yep, absolutely. So coming out of ICSC,
yes,
cautious optimism, all these different shifts. I'm curious, we can take this in a couple different ways. AI is obviously a big component, something I've talked to a couple different, on the broker side, retail brokers, about how AI is kind of tripping them up a little bit, because sometimes tenants will come to negotiations with something like ChatGPT gave them to ask about, and it's maybe a little out of left field or inappropriate. But at the same time, AI and technology is making a lot of the due diligence process and site, again, discovery process, hell of a lot faster. So I'm curious, from everything that's happening with tech advancements, and AI is such an interesting thing, because I think, it's not often, maybe the cell phone was the last thing, the iPhone, it's not often a new piece of technology really transforms all the way through to the public sector into communities. And I think this has really struck a lot of people and different nerves. So I'm curious, what are you watching from that slant? Whether it's the tenants, whether it's how they're thinking about consumers, with how operators in commercial real estate are dealing with one another.
Yeah.
What's most top of mind for you?
Yeah, look, everyone is talking about AI. I was invited to speak last year at the Prop Tech, ICSC Prop Tech in Vegas, and there was a bunch of different speakers from all around the world. And I think kind of the general sentiment is everyone's doing some really cool things, but it's so much in its infancy. I don't think generally we kind of have a grasp on just how powerful and useful the tool is. And I think, our teams at Centennial are, we've got a bunch of different work groups that are already starting to utilize the tool in their day-to-day work. And we get together every week and we kind of do a show and tell.
That's
and
fun.
It's really actually amazing to see some of the stuff that comes out. And I share that because that's an important element of kind of learning the tool and how it can help. So I think generally in the industry, we're still very much, in the early days of trying to figure out, what we can use it for and how it can be, useful. I think, look, there are some use cases of where it's helping for everything from negotiating leases, lease abstracting, to putting together plans based on very basic information. You can actually model a whole project and come up with a performer.
It's insane.
It's crazy. Don't know about the accuracy, but but I've seen a few programs where it's actually pretty good. So I think we'll continue to see some of that. The part that I'm not seeing too much of, which will be very interesting, is how it's making that connection between online and the consumer, and what I mean, and brick and mortar. So for online brick and mortar to the consumer, what I mean is, if you go search for a pair of shoes, it'll probably tell you the retailers that have that pair of shoes. We have a platform we've been utilizing at Centennial for the last few years called Shop Now. And what that does is uses an algorithm so if you are within close proximity of one of a Centennial shopping center and you go search for those shoes, it will point you to one of our centers and the retailer that's at the center that has the shoes.
Okay.
Cool. So that's a good way of starting to bridge that. But what it can't do is then take that next step of saying, okay, how do you then facilitate that transaction so you can show up to the shopping center and it's there waiting for you. I think the ability for AI to be able to inform and maybe redirect a consumer in terms of either making a purchase decision or making a different purchase decision or maybe a smarter purchase decision. I think that's the area that is going to evolve of where AI comes in handy. I mean, we already know there are groups out there right now that are working with AI and driverless vehicle technology to be able to go to the mall, pick up an item, and actually bring it to your house.
Oh, who's grabbing it from? Is it getting put in the car?
It's getting put in the car.
Like, is still Waymo driving into the store?
But to the point where those vehicles that can drive themselves, there will come a day where the car, like if you own, a driverless vehicle or a vehicle that has autonomous driving, I should say, is that, AI could instruct the vehicle to leave your driveway, go to the mall, pick it up, and bring it back for you.
Oof. Watch out, UPS.
Right, talk about the Jetsons, right?
Yeah.
But, and who knows if that's, eventuate in the way that I articulated it or not. But I do think that there is some glue that's going to happen there between AI and the consumer behavior and, how that connection, is made with the retailer, and ultimately helping that conversion in a much smarter and faster way.
Yeah.
So I think that's coming. But I think in general with AI, it's highly exciting. In some respects, it's nerve-wracking. I have people say to me, AI is going to take jobs, and I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think it actually is going to free up time for us to be smarter. And to use the output and the data that comes out of it to kind of be a little bit more thoughtful and strategic about what we want to do, not just in terms of how we maybe merchandise a shopping center or how we're operating our business, but like I said, being able to walk into a shopping center and say, to AI, say one of the engines like Claude, I need a gift for a graduation. What can I get?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, not only have half a dozen options of knowing where it is, but then to actually make that purchase and go into the store and pick it up.
Yeah. I actually have a friend who takes Claude, she gave Claude a name, and goes shopping and will take pictures of outfits and say, what do you think of this? Give me your honest opinion. Would this look good on me?
Is that right?
Yeah. And I'm like, okay, yeah, you know what? I'll take it. That's awesome.
Yeah.
You're going shopping. You're still in the stores.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about AI, and again, mobile was maybe the big last disruptor in this way, but I'm very curious to see what will happen with AI being every consumer's portal into the digital realm, such that websites may or may not be created for human visitors anymore. It might all be agents going and finding the things for you and bringing back the pictures. And so in that reality, I'm very interested to see how retailers and brands evolve if that is now kind of their customer until they get into the real world where they're actually, handling the merchandise and interacting again with the experience that being there provides.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
Yeah.
I was telling my wife on the weekend, I remember seeing the first iPhone. It was actually at the Grove, at the Apple store at the Grove. And I remember walking past and they had it in the window there, and it was this little iPhone.
Yeah.
And
they
I
were
was
chunky. They were like this thick.
Yeah. Actually, it came up because my wife found her first iPhone.
Oh, yeah.
So and we were looking at it, and I remember seeing it, and I'm like, who the hell's going to use that? I'm like the whole like the
BlackBerry
number pad, and I was just like,
yep.
I found my old BlackBerry too. I can't believe
they
my
were so great.
fingers got around that. But I think the point being that I'm trying to make is we didn't know how useful it could be.
Yeah.
Like if you didn't have your iPad, you'd miss it, right? If you didn't have it there to use. And so the point being is we don't know how powerful these things are yet until we've had an opportunity to use it and have it kind of move the needle in terms of how it changes our lives.
Yeah.
And that's the exciting part of AI.
Yeah.
To your point, is kind of and also how it helps evolve retailers, because look, we could have a whole discussion about, how from a retailer perspective, it can anticipate and predict what a consumer is going to be wanting based on certain trends.
Yeah, very true.
That are coming out.
You shouldn't have said that towards the end of our conversation, because now we're going to have a part 2 about this.
But it's true. And I think that to me, then that's why I'm saying we were only at the very beginning of a cusp of what this could be. Mm-hmm. And I think once it gathers momentum, which it is, it's going to move pretty fast. Mm-hmm. The good news is, just like with the iPhone and the iPad and the technology that we enjoy today and we frankly take for granted, I think in a lot of respects, AI will do that for retail. Mm-hmm. And we'll look back and we'll have a podcast that hopefully you'll invite me to in a couple of years.
Yeah.
And we'll look back at it and say, remember we were talking about what was an idea, and actually it's going to probably be a reality.
Yeah, it's crazy being around in a time when history is being made. That's for sure.
It's cool though.
It's very cool. It's very energizing, like you said. A couple last questions for you. Looking ahead, if you had to like paint a picture of how you would shape the future of retail 10 years from now, and I know AI is part of that conversation, what is your vision of what the future of shopping centers looks like?
I think, and we've started to see some of this, which is, a comparison that I'll make is with the Australian retail industry and kind of the shopping trip in Australia versus the United States. And in Australia, when I grew up, you'd go to a shopping centre and, you could go browse, buy a pair of jeans, you could buy a top, you could go, grab a smoothie, you could sit down, grab a bite to eat, you go watch a movie, then you could go do your banking, you could go book a trip to Europe.
Yeah. Travel agents. I love them.
And then, on the way back, on the way out, you could stop at the grocery store and buy a bunch of stuff, and you have not moved your car. And I think, I'm starting to see more of that shift towards the consolidation of the retail business here in the United States. And some's come out of the necessity of repurposing empty and vacant space, unproductive space. But we're seeing grocery stores coming in now. We're seeing banks and financial institutions that are coming into centers now, medical, fitness. All of these are starting to kind of find their way into these shopping destinations, which I think is really exciting. So in answer to your question of kind of where do I see, what's my vision? I think it's really creating this collection of, not just retail, but services as well, to be these destinations where you do truly want to come and hang out for a little while and enjoy as kind of a break from, whatever else you're doing in the office or at home. Yeah. So I think there'll be more of that. And the part that I'm most excited about is there's more of a willingness for shopping center owners and developers to really invest in experience. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it wouldn't happen because unless that investment was tied to a return on that investment, it would typically not happen. But now there's a real deliberate desire to invest in those experiences, and I hope that continues because I think what we're going to end up with is not only destinations that have a wide range of services and offerings, but they're just going to be really awesome places that you want to hang out. Yeah. I think that's where we're headed. Yeah,
it's exciting stuff. And, the next maybe logical evolution of that is you start getting apartments there. Suddenly there's offices there, and then you get a city. That's how things are made.
And that's kind of what they want to be is the town square, right? And so I do think that we're going to head there. And also it's probably going to be through necessity as well. I mean, a lot of these urban destinations are becoming more and more gridlocked with traffic and, unless they have some decent public transport infrastructure, these shopping destinations that are in, urbanized cities are going to want to have a lot more of those amenities, including residential and office, and you won't want to go very far from home.
Yes, absolutely. Unless you got a driverless car taking you there.
Or that.
And even then. Paul, this has been so much fun. Before I let you go and hop on a jet, are you going back to Texas anytime this week? Or
not this afternoon.
Not this afternoon.
No. I'm in town for a few days and I'll be back in Texas next week.
So you can relax a little bit. But before I let you go, do you have any final thoughts, words you'd like to share with our listeners, words of advice, just any message you want to get out there before we let you go?
Keep shopping.
Keep shopping.
No, look, I would say, when I joined Centennial, and one of the first addresses that I made to the company, I was asked a similar question. So there's one word of advice, and I would just say for folks in our industry is just continue to be curious. I think it's so important. Like every day waking up, and it's just kind of, if you see something, you hear something, you read something, why? Like dig a little deeper. And that becomes incredibly important when you think about AI, because it's pretty smart, but it's going to be smarter if you're a little bit more curious, and think about, what's perhaps, the unknown, what's, the unachievable, because I think with AI, together with kind of where retail is right now, it's probably achievable. So we just need to be curious.
Yeah, keep asking questions.
And
I
shop.
love it. And shop.
Keep spending.
Like I said, you do not have to tell me twice. Oh, man. So thank you so much again for joining us. Where can our listeners find you if they want to get in touch? If you want to have social media, company social media, email, website?
So you can find us on LinkedIn, and you can obviously visit our company website, which is centennialrec.com. And you'll find my details there, and I'd love to hear from anyone that is happy to reach out and share some thoughts. And I'm always keen to meet new people. So
yeah, I love it. Please
reach
reach out. Yes, please do, and we'll put all the links and everything in the show notes.
Shanti, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone who tuned in today. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know. Leave us a comment, a rating, a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you're listening. We also have our full library of episodes on crexi.com/podcast. And if you prefer video, you can visit our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Crexi. Take care and be sure to tune in next time.